So we've been covering the prophet Micah. We've been looking at the things he has to say to largely the southern half of the divided kingdom. He has a number of admonitions for them, encouragements and challenges. He condemns the leaders pretty directly. And we've kind of been focusing on this big question, which is going to get answered pretty directly in chapter 6. But the question is, what does God want? What does God want? What does he want from his people? What does he want from nations? What kind of behavior does he like to see? And that's kind of been the question we've been asking this entire time. We started by seeing, really, a whole lot of what God doesn't want. We've seen condemnation against the leaders of Israel, the spiritual leaders, the political leaders. People have been mistreated. There's been a great deal of sin that's been condemned, and that judgment is coming, and that there's no way to get around it at this point. That's kind of one of the big things we've been discussing. Last week, we looked at chapter 4, which started to turn the tone of the book a little bit. We started to see visions of a nation that God is putting together, where a place at the foot of a mountain, where a temple is built, and it's full of people from all over the world. There's a beautiful vision there where people are free from ignorance, they're free from want, they're free from conflict. And when I read that chapter, all I can think is, man, that's a place I want to be. We're going to see a little bit more of what God has in store for these people in chapter 5. We're starting to get into a little bit of who's going to be in charge of this nation, or who's going to be taking care of this people. And I think you'll start to see some symbols that make sense to you, that might be familiar to you. Let's go ahead and read it. We'll read chapter 5. I've asked Grant to read it for us, and then we'll go from there.
Micah chapter 5. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be a ruler in Israel, whose coming is forth from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. When the Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces, then we will rise against him the 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men, and they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. And he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of the people, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of sheep, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears to pieces, and there is none to deliver. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all of your enemies shall be cut off. And in that day, declares the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you and destroy your chariots. And I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down your strongholds. And I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more tellers of fortune. And I will cut off your carved images and your pillars among you, and you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. And I will root out your Asherah images from among you and destroy your cities. And in anger and wrath I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of information. The way I've broken it down, I've got a couple different sections, and I'm going to do my best to give you interpretations. When we deal with prophecy, there's always a question of what it means, right? We're dealing with visions, we're dealing with consequences. The consequences parts, I think, are pretty easy to understand. When we get into the visions and the things that are to come, the idea of symbols or people, that's when it gets a little harder. And so I will tell you, as I've told you, I hope throughout most of this class, I'm not an expert in this stuff. I'm going to do my best to give you my interpretation. I am welcome to other ideas, and I'm sure as we read, as we discuss, hopefully you will have some interpretations as well. I'm going to give you my best crack at some of these things here. Some of this is pretty straightforward, I think. Some of it is not so straightforward, and just have an open mind. Let's look at the first couple verses here, verses 1 through 6. I think the first thing that we see here, obviously we've been talking a lot throughout this book about how Israel's going to be humbled. They're going to be judged mostly by oppression from foreign nations. God is going to use these nations to come in and oppress them. That's still part of the message here. I don't want that to be forgotten, and I don't think the prophet wants that to be forgotten either. Muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. This judgment's still coming. The political strength of Israel is going to fail. That's the scene in which we are dealing out these prophecies. We need to know that. It says, even our judges will bear insults. In this time of humiliation, though, something else is coming. Someone else, some person, we might say. God is going to raise up a ruler from a lowly place. And we begin to see a lot of information about this ruler, right? We have a couple different things that we see. First of all, this king, we've seen images of a king already. I think it was back in chapter 2 at the end, specifically in verses 12 through 13. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together in a sheepfold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens up the breach goes before them. They break out and through past the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head. So the Lord has positioned himself as their king, but here we see this image again. There's a king that is coming. You, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, you who are little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is going to be ruler of Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. So we get a portrait of this individual. We start getting some ideas of what this person is like. The first thing that is pointed out is that this person is going to come from Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was the city that was well known to them. It was the hometown of David. It was Israel's greatest king, at least in their, he was a powerful king in his day, and then he sort of passed into myth as a figure from old who was a king who unified the territories of Israel by conquest. So David, he was also seen as a great man of God. He was a righteous man despite his many flaws. And so David was kind of a symbol for them in more ways than one. It was truly little among the thousands of Judah is what the text says. Bethlehem was not a big place. Like it was podunk. Almost nothing there, especially as you get farther on in the history of Israel. And yeah, this is the place that God chooses where this great king, this great ruler is going to come from. I think that's a symbol that would have been familiar to them because they knew David and they knew David's history. And so it's not that far-fetched that someone great will come out of someplace small. It ends up being emblematic of the Hebrew people in general. That's a really big point. Now, I'll tell you, if you've never had this experience, it means a lot, right? When you see someone big and important come from your hometown. For many years, while he was a representative in the House of Reps, Mike Pence, who became our vice president, was like my next door neighbor. He lived just one street over from me. And so you can imagine, all of us who knew him as he walked his dog, we would see him in the neighborhood. He went on to become the vice president. That was a big deal. Like, this is someone we knew, and he went on to do great things. So the people of Bethlehem, when they hear this, not only do they have a history of having a great man, King David, come from their hometown, but I would hope that this prophecy brought them some hope as well. Oh, somebody great, some leader that's going to take us out of this oppression is going to come from our hometown. We're going to be paying attention, right? We're going to be looking at that. But the point here is that Bethlehem is a small place, and that's where that's where this great person's coming from. So that should be a contrast to us. We should see that for what it is. A couple interesting things about Bethlehem. You may know this already, but I just think this is too interesting to pass up. Bethlehem, the name, means house of bread, right? It's a bakery. But then this other name here that I was less familiar with, Bethlehem Ephrathah, I wasn't sure what that meant. It's incredibly fitting that this name kind of means fruitfulness. So the fruitful house of bread, the productive house of bread, and it carries with it, based on my understanding, an implication that it's being fruitful almost to the point of exhaustion. Like, we can't produce any more bread. That's how much bread this house of bread is producing. You're producing so much bread that you are running out of resources, you're being exhausted, and then we see here the connections start to fall into place for us. Jesus in John chapter 6, verse 35, calls himself the bread of life. This is a symbol that he used for himself frequently. He came from Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem. And I think it's incredibly fitting that the bread of life, quite literally, is the bread of life who is so fruitful to the point of exhaustion. He sacrifices everything. He has nothing left on the table. I'm not going to mince words here. I think this is who this king is. I think we're talking about Jesus in some capacity. That's who this great leader is. A couple other things. He's going to come from the clan of Judah. Judah was one of the 12 tribes. He was authoritative. It was suggested that he was the one that suggested Joseph be sold into slavery rather than let to die in a pit. And so he ends up being kind of this forceful voice among his brothers. Authority like this then is central to the identity of the tribe who shares his name later on in Hebrew history. The clan of Judah was one of the first tribes that settled in the land of Israel, particularly in the south, right? So they're dealing with the tribe of Judah here with most of this prophecy. Many powerful leaders, King David, came from this tribe. Judah, Benjamin were the only tribes that remained loyal to the house of David during the big divide, during the big split. So we know that, again, this king, this ruler is going to come out of Judah. There's a kingly line there. But then we get this interesting idea that he's going to come from ages long past, from days of eternity. So this isn't just some guy. This isn't just some person who's going to show up on the scene and be the new political leader. This is someone with authority and knowledge and wisdom of old. So we're getting a portrait of someone more important, bigger here than just whoever the next king is going to be. John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning the Word was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and in that life was the light of all mankind. Again, we're talking about someone who is ancient of days here, this leader that is going to come in and fill this spot. We see that he's going to shepherd his flock in particular. In verse 4, he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of his name, in the Lord of his God. Fits in with our descriptions in chapter 2. I mean, we've seen gathering language throughout the entirety of the book. In chapter 4, there was a massive gathering of people. Here, the Lord will be gathering his flock as well. I will certainly assemble all of you together. I will gather the remnant of Israel. And the king is going to pass on before them, the Lord at his head, there in chapter 2. And then the last characteristic here is kind of at the bottom, verses 5 through 6. He shall be their peace. This is where it gets a little weird, and this is where I need you to bear with me. Verse 5, he shall be their peace. When the Assyrian comes to our land and treads in our places, he will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. They shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. There are many ways to read this. I'm going to try and give you my reading, what I think is the understanding here. I think we need to understand that the prophet is mixing together several things, visions of a near future, right? They're going to be under oppression, and then after that time of oppression, they will be delivered. I think he's also mixing together images of something that is afar off, something that is to come. I think that's why we're seeing these very clear allusions to Jesus showing up here. The easiest way that I can connect this information is that I think it falls back on the promises in chapter 4, verses 12 through 13. He says, they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan, that he gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion. I will make your horn iron. I will make your hooves bronze, and you shall beat into pieces many people, and shall devote their grain to the Lord, their wealth, and to the Lord of the whole earth. I think it's a portrait of how the Lord will continually raise up powerful men and leaders, shepherds, kings, princes of men, in order to defeat the enemies of God. I think that's what's being said here. There are some people who would read this and interpret it as God giving authority to a number of regional spirits in the area. That's not my interpretation. That's one interpretation. I think the simpler reading is just we're seeing God is going to deal with nations as he's been dealing with nations this entire book. He's going to deal with them faithfully, whether they were obedient or disobedient. We see that again echoed at the end of chapter 5. Really what I take from this is that ultimate forgiveness, peace, and righteousness are gifts that are granted to the nations by God. That is his gift to give, and he will accomplish it however he wants, whether he uses pagan nations or whether he uses Israel. He will do that. He's not going to allow disobedient nations to rage against him forever, and so he will raise up 7 shepherds, 8 princes of men. That's my interpretation. I'm open to other ones, but I do think we need to see that statement, he shall be their peace. Again, another very clear direction, a clear line to Jesus. This king is coming, and that's a real big deal. Thoughts, comments, questions about the first part of Micah 5? Okay, that's fine. This is the part of the chapter that I feel the weirdest about. It's the hardest to interpret, and I do my best with it. So that's what I'll say. We'll look at the next section here, verses 7 through 8. So your heading in your Bible might say something about the remnant will be delivered. It might say something along those lines. Remnant is the theme here in the next couple verses. The remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for man, nor wait for the children of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of the peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of sheep, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces, and there is none to deliver. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and your enemies shall be cut off. So God is going to give his people victory, right? And it's not going to be some small thing. In particular, the remnant, which, if you don't remember what a remnant is, it's just whatever's left over, right? So we're talking about after the time of punishment, the time of judgment. Once the judgment is over, the people of Israel that have been preserved, those who are left over, the remnant, God is going to allow this remnant of people in Israel to prosper among the nations. That's always kind of been God's promise. If you look back at Deuteronomy chapter 8, when they were getting ready to go in the land, you're going to go in, you're going to prosper, the Lord's going to give you all this stuff, but if you forget me, if you disobey me, then there will be judgment. That's always kind of been the bargain he makes with Israel. God, when he delivers his people, it's not going to be a small event. It's going to affect everyone who hears about it in every single surrounding nation. That's also been the history of Israel to this point. You might remember the words of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. She was living in the land of Canaan. She was living in Jericho. And she says to the spies there, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Og, whom you utterly destroyed. The people of Israel, as they accomplished great things, really at the behest of God, with the authority of God, with the power of God, the people around them knew about it. That was their reputation. We've heard what God has done for you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, how he allowed you to conquer these kings. And that's going to be what reoccurs here as well. The remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers from the grass. I think it's also really interesting here that the remnant preserved by God will be feared. They'll command respect among the nations. When God delivers Zion, it's not going to be a weak deliverance. It's going to strengthen Israel so that she's going to triumph over her enemies. The image here is like a lion among sheep. You compare a lion to a squirrel. There's no competition who wins. It's the lion. The lion wins. And Israel's being set up as the lion here. I also like this image of dew and showers. Dew is being portrayed as like a refreshing thing, right? When you're covered over with dew, when your plants are covered over with dew, it brings new life. But it's also contrasted with the idea of the shower, the flood, the storm that might wipe away the other nations. Israel is going to be in a place of great strength. And we had somebody who commented in our class last week about how these great things are really all coming upon Israel, not because of their greatness, but in spite of it, right? Bethlehem, small city, Israel, small nation. God picks up this nation and makes them great, and that's what sets them apart, not their intrinsic greatness. They are small, and God does great things with them. The consequences of this knowledge are that the rebellious and sinful nations around them are going to be reaping the whirlwind, sometimes at the hand of God, because he's going to have plans for them, sometimes at the strength of Israel. Comments, questions, thoughts about that? Okay, I guess I'm doing a great job today. Nobody's asking any questions. That's fine. That's fine. This is a harder chapter for me, I think. Let's see. Oh, there's a point I didn't cover here. Their power is going to be restored. None's going to have any power to oppose them. So the Jewish nation, as it returns from Babylonian captivity, they're going to find their nation exalted in a physical sense. But I think the emphasis here is probably less on that triumph in a political sense, but more on the idea of righteousness and the sort of spiritual well-being of the nation. It's not an elevation of an earthly kingdom. God's purpose, instead, is going to be regarded as the destruction of the sinful kingdom. We're going to get into a part here in a minute where it also gets a little difficult to interpret. You're going to see a list of things that are removed from the nation. God's going to remove the nation, and we'll talk about that in a second. Jacob, you got a question? Comment? They're coming all the way down.
I'm wondering about verse 7, the idea of the remnant in the midst of many peoples, like dew. Mine says like dew from the Lord. When I think of the people scattered among the nations as a blessing, It reminds me of the salt and light idea, or Israel as a light to the nations. Is even when Israel is not whole and they've been judged and there's this dispersion, that God can still use that to benefit, especially the remnant who remain faithful to Him. I am just intrigued by how this idea permeates Scripture, that God puts us in the midst of people who don't know Him to benefit them and to bring glory to Him. And I think of the parable of the tares, where you have wheat and weeds growing together, and the master says, no, we're not going to uproot the wheat. Sometimes we feel that tension where we want to be uprooted and we want to isolate from the world and only be around other people who don't bother or tax us or in some way inconvenience us with their immorality. That's never God's plan. God's plan is that we permeate it and we bless it. So I'm wondering if He's even looking at, the Assyrians come, there's damage here, but even in that, God can use His people to affect change and good among the nations.
Yeah, there's so many lines, so many ideas you could connect to that thought. I really do love that image of the people of God being both a benefit to those whom they're around and also maybe a detriment to the wicked. I think there's power in both places that God gives them. I think when I grew up reading the Bible, and this is obviously a childish notion, but I think you grow up and you have this sense that God is striving with the people of Israel, which He obviously did. And because the Bible just doesn't really cover it in any great capacity, with a few notable exceptions like Obadiah, you don't think about God dealing with other nations too. You don't think about God having faithful people in other places. And I find that idea kind of silly. Like God dealt with people all over the world. He just has a special relationship with the people of Israel that was very unique. It was very direct. It was very specific. But then when the people of Israel got scattered all over the place, I mean, you could think of the way that God blessed Jacob. It obviously benefited his family as well. His father-in-law benefited from the great wealth that Jacob amassed underneath him. And so the people of God, when they are prospering, that prosperity is going to just ooze out of them to the people around them. I know that's a thing that I've experienced. The blessings that I have received in my life have been the kinds of things I've been able to pass on to people around me. I hope that will continue, and I think that's true for us too. So if we are isolated, then we won't be able to refresh those around us. Now, the flip side of that is I haven't done any great destruction. I don't know that I've been a destructive force. I hope I haven't been a destructive force to the people in my life. But I think the righteousness of God is inherently going to be a dividing thing. It's going to draw lines between the righteous and the unrighteous. And you may experience that in your lives as well. And I think you need to be willing for both possibilities. Thank you for that. That was a good thought. Yes, Aaron.
I've always found it interesting how you have this image of God's people as being blessings to the people around them. You can go all the way back to Genesis when Joseph was in Pharaoh's kingdom, and by Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, they were able to successfully weather the 7 years of famine. By even when Jacob is sent to Laban, Laban prospers as a result of Jacob being here, and in fact he recognizes that. And that's part of why he tries to keep Jacob there. And then when you have Daniel in the Babylonian kingdom, and Nebuchadnezzar is prosperous partly because Daniel and his cohort from Judah are such faithful ministers in the kingdom that he's set up. You can go on and on. There are so many other examples of men of God in places where, by their simple existence, again, Joseph in the Potiphar's household, he's blessed just because Joseph is there. And so the presence of God's people is a blessing to the people around them if they are willing to serve God. And I think that's when we look at Micah is obviously drawing from his experiences and the people's experiences that he's talking to. So he's talking about Assyria. Assyria is the nation that has come in, invaded, and done terrible things to the land of Israel. But what he's saying here is that God's people, even if they are scattered among those people, they're ultimately going to triumph because God brings about good things through those people.
Yeah, it's not their strength of arms, it's not their unity, it's not their wealth. It's the fact that God will care for them and provide good things for them. Good. Another one over here.
This is the way that God has always operated. He blessed Adam and Eve until they sinned. They were punished, sent out of the garden. And every time this cycle, he makes promises and he keeps them. When they obey him, they're blessed. When they don't, they bear the consequences. But he always provides for some future time that he will bring them back under his fold. And sometimes he uses other nations to punish them. Sometimes it's lack of elements that he punishes them with. But this is just how God works, and he did it all through the Old Testament. And you would think by now they would realize that God does what he says he will do as far as punishment and blessing. And they've experienced it wandering in the wilderness, complaining about the food, the serpent on the staff. He's constant, and they don't seem to get it. And of course, it's easy for us to say that when we're looking back at what they went through. It's so obvious to us, but yet we do the same thing.
Yeah, there's a very obvious through line of God's faithfulness, right? That seems to be, I don't know, one of the portraits. Anytime you talk about the blessings that are offered out by God to his people, especially after time of punishment, just because God judges wrongdoing in his people doesn't mean he's forgotten that he's promised to care for them. He will carry them forward. He will preserve this remnant, and he will make them great among the nations. But I think it's hard for us to wrap our mind around that because we can see only about this much in front of us at any given time, and so judgment seems all-encompassing, right? When punishment gets handed down, it's like the end of the road, and that's just not the way God sees it. He sees them completely different. Good. Other thoughts? There's one here and then one over here. Yeah, missing.
So my take here is much more of a question, because when I read this passage, there's a lot that I, as you've pointed out, there's a lot that I just don't understand. I appreciate verse 7, the idea of, God's people benefiting those around them. I think that is definitely how Christians are to live, be salt and light, and bring good things to the world. How do you or anyone else who can shed some light on this carry that in connection with verse 8, where it seems to clearly be that this remnant that is dwelling among the Gentiles is like a lion going through and treading down and tearing in pieces and causing destruction rather than bringing the benefits or the blessings that we might expect in the way that we are interpreting verse 7.
It's a very good question, and it's one that's hard to answer. My best guess, again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, is that there is a sense in which the prominence of Israel that God is granting them will be destructive to pagan nations, right? Like, it's not just that blessings are going to flow out from the nation of Israel and it's going to be all peaceful. Like, the pagan nations around them are still going to be destroyed. God has already, he promised that in chapter 4. I think that promise carries through here. A lion amongst the beasts of the forest, like a young lion amongst the flocks of the sheep. Obviously, it's kind of hard to parse out because Israel doesn't really, they don't ever, to my knowledge, decimate Assyria by the sword. So I don't know that portion of it is necessarily the immediate. Remember, we in prophecy, you've got immediate conclusions and you've got future conclusions. I think this may be a future promise of the destruction of idols, of the way that the nation God rises up, particularly the one at the mountain, is one that overcomes the pagan nations. We're playing with two different things here. I don't think it's a literal military conquest for Israel over Syria. I think it's much more spiritual than that. That's my best reading. Again, I'm open to other ideas. There's one here, and then Cole.
I think to answer the question, my thoughts on it are that to reconcile the two verses, that whole section really is that's the nature of Jesus and God, is that you will be blessed. They're there to bring blessings to those who will receive it. And verse 9 says, your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries and your enemies. So to me, that's the destruction that's being talked about here is going to come upon all those who reject it.
Good. Cool. Sorry, I kept you waiting there. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'm glad. I wanted that question to get answered because my comment is nothing related to that. So,
Does that answer your question before we move on to something else? Does that help? That's kind of a difficult question to answer. Yes.
I think for me, it was just, you said our sight was like this big, and I think sometimes that's a good thing. I was just going to say, just because sometimes we're trying to, I feel like when I was reading like about the ruler who would come from Israel, from Bethlehem, it's like, we're thinking Jesus, and they were thinking him too, that he was going to basically tear them to pieces, and like, we're going to get Israel back, and we're going to rule like the whole world, here. And that's not what the goal was. And I just think, I look at this and it's like, sometimes it's just better to keep your vision shorter, like kind of what you said, just focus on here and now. Like we have the ability, because we're scattered, to teach the gospel everywhere. Or, when sometimes some of us are looking out, and when I think about this in life, like this is an election year, so a lot of people are worried about the country and what's going to happen with the country in the next 4 years, which I think in this country we're blessed with that right. But it's also like sometimes we're looking out 4 or 5 years for nothing that, whatever comes of it, like, are we going to take that situation and use it as God would have it to be used? So that was my 2 cents on.
Good to trust in God, right? Wait on his plan.
Sorry, I don't have anything about Cole's comment. I was talking about the question a minute ago.
Fine.
I think Troy's question. Although he's far away, I think that was him. I think of this, the contrast between the blessing and the judgment, or however you want to frame that, in verses 8 and 9, as a lot like what happens with Israel when they go into captivity. You look at Daniel, and Daniel is such an awesome figure. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are too, where they bless the people around them if they're open to that. On the other hand, they draw out the jealousy and really some judgment on some of those people. The people that come after Daniel, they don't do well. Esther and Mordecai are similar, where the people that try to attack God and his people, even though they're scattered and they don't have a clear leader and they're not at home, they're not in Jerusalem, there's no king, God takes care of them. So they bless the people on the one hand, but they also are not taken over on the other hand. And they're, even in Esther, literally fighting. And Nehemiah is similar as they come back. It's just that sense that God is with them. And that can have 2 prongs depending on how people respond to them. One of them is, if you take their faith seriously and you see what God's doing through them and for them, then it draws you to God and it's a blessing to you. But if you try to attack them because it looks like they're vulnerable, which many people do, God just stands up for them. And I think this is intended to be a reassurance for God's people that I'm not going to abandon you just because you're going to be scattered. There'll be a remnant that I'm going to take care of, and that'll be good in both these ways for you.
Yeah, Esther's a great example there. I mean, God has a finger on the scales. He's benefiting his people, and that's just a really explicit example of all that working out. Good. Aaron. I think we'll take Aaron's comment and we'll move on to the last section here.
I'll take a crack at it also. I think to make an easy comparison today, we had, or in recent history, it's pretty easy to identify Nazi Germany as an evil empire. But you had people like Oskar Schindler and the Ten Boom family and other people like that who were lights in that darkness. And they provide such a contrast with people like Himmler and other people like that in Nazi Germany. And you see the story that good triumphs, evil is defeated. And we can identify what they did and what those men did as evil and what the other people did as light and good. And the lives that they saved and the people that they helped, celebrate those, and they were drawn to them. They were light and salt to those people around them. And I think history tramples underfoot the people who did evil while lifting the people who saved lives and the people who were good up.
Yeah, and it's more than history, right? It's God watching the way the people of Israel behave, and he will lift up leaders. I mean, he does that when you read about them returning from captivity. He brings back faithful people. Ezra is one of my favorite examples. He holds them up and he blesses them as they try to reestablish their nation. Good. We're going to head on to the last section here just for the sake of time. I'm going to cover the last couple verses. Verses 10 through 15. So there's a couple ways to read these last couple verses, and I'll sort of lay them out for you. But I think we start with this continuing pronouncement that the enemies of God are doomed. Now, you can read the enemies of God as one of two things here, I think. You can either read it as the sinful people that are still operating within Israel, or you can read it as the pagan nations that surround them, maybe even the ones that are going to oppress them. I'll be honest, I am not sure which way to take it, but I think that because we've already seen Israel humbled and we're seeing them rebuilt up here, I think these might be more directed at the pagan nations, but you could make an application either way. In that day, declares the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you. I will destroy your chariots. I will cut off the deities of your land. Throw down all your strongholds. I will cut off sorceries from your land. You will have no more tellers of fortunes. I will cut off your carved images and your pillars among you. You shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. I will root out the Ashtoreth images from among you and destroy your cities. And in anger and wrath, I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. That's what leads me to believe that it's more the nations that we're talking about here rather than Israel. But there's a couple things here, right? If Israel obeys God, then they won't be subject to these things. Certainly the pagan nations who are full of these evils are going to have these things done to them as well. Their military might is not going to save them in the face of their judgment. Their great infrastructure, their cities, their fortifications are not going to save them. The magic that they might rely on, with their fortune tellers and their sorcerers, isn't going to save them. Their idols aren't going to save them because their idols are dumb. They're just stone and wood and rock. And of course, their achievements are not going to save them. The work of their hands, the things that they have built won't save them. God's going to have vengeance, I think, on these disobedient nations, especially even the ones that have been oppressing Israel to this point, even the ones that God has been using maybe to oppress Israel. That was the promise in chapter 4. They do not know the Lord's plan. They do not understand his plan in chapter 4. The ultimate judgment of all of humanity, I think, can be seen in this. The totality of God's judgment is going to last for longer than we might be able to imagine. His patience is great, but there will come a time when it ends. Rebellious and sinful nations, intent upon serving their lusts, are going to endure the wrath of their Creator. As Paul sort of expresses later in Romans, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. All of these things get in the way of God's righteousness. Their wealth, their reliance on their military might, certainly their reliance on sorcerers or magicians or fortune tellers, and their reliance on idols is a big, big problem. Again, I think that's a condemnation of the nations. I don't think that's Israel, but Israel is certainly going to have these things purified out of them as well, probably by the judgment that came beforehand. So, comments, questions here about some of the final parts of the chapter. I'll give you my questions, and these are the kinds of things I've been thinking about in this chapter. What aspects of Jesus do you bring to mind most often? I think we see some of them here. Comes from a small town. He is the bread of life. He's a great king, comes from authoritative clan. How does Micah's vision of a king help us to know Jesus better? I think we need to be asking that question. What honors has God given to the church? How has he preserved us in the same way that he preserved the remnant of Israel? I think there's an easy parallel to be drawn there. What are we looking to for salvation besides God without knowing it? Is there something that's getting in our way? We've got to be able to take these idols out of our lives. We can't be relying on the things the pagan nations are relying on. Comments, questions, thoughts as we wrap up for the day. 5 minutes. Aaron.
If no one else is going to raise their hand, I'll take a final stab here. The thing I see in this passage that's really interesting to me is you can see the disruptive nature of leadership. Jesus is coming. He's going to disrupt the Jews out of their status quo. He's going to raise up leaders who are going to disrupt the nations around them. his people planted in wicked nations are going to be a disruptive influence to the evil that is around them. By its very nature, excellent leadership is disruptive. It's disruptive to people, because it forces people to acknowledge that their lives aren't what they should be, and that they need to change, and that there's something that they need to do. And that's who Jesus was when he came. So he comes from this small town, but while he's in that small town, the people, they're disturbed by him when he goes back home to preach, because they say, isn't this Joseph and Mary's son? It's disruptive to how they want to think about things. And then his apostles, his disciples, they go on to be disruptive to the world around them. If it weren't, then people wouldn't have tried to kill them and stone them and take away their property. And we need to have that in mind, that even today, among a nation where our highest virtue is to lack virtue, we need to be disruptive influences.
And Israel certainly would have been that.
Kind of along that same line, I mean, how many times have we read about a remnant in the Bible? It seems like every time it seems like God is wiped out, or, God's people are wiped out, a remnant is mentioned, and the remnant gets strong. And I think it kind of, for me at least, it kind of shows me that there's always hope, there's always God on your side, and the importance of what role we as Christians need to be in the world. You think about everything we talked about this morning. Sin's been in the world since the Garden of Eden, and yet God has always created a way for us to overcome.
Very good. Any others? He's good with that.
I think we see a lot of uncertainty in what's going on in this complex interaction between nations and peoples, and it's been going on for a long time. I'm talking about in the time frame of when Micah wrote. And I think the one thing that screams out at me is the word peace, when it says in the King James Version, "And this one shall be peace." That's what the world needs. And we know that Jesus is what is meant by this. It's easy for us to see that getting along with people, he is the clear example of how to do that. And we may find uncertainty here, but I think this is the certainty of the end of Micah, that peace is coming. God is pronouncing both judgment and peace. And those are extraordinary promises if you're trying to live through them. Peace is much easier than what the Israel was living through.
It's almost like there's a really famous verse that gets quoted from this
Very
book
useful.
all the time. And we're going to see